Hey, welcome to the Give Me Liberty podcast. Are truckers going to save Western civilization as we know it? Is the New York Times the best place to learn about the divided state of evangelicalism? And we sit down with Samuel Say to talk about cancel culture at Spotify. All of this on the Give Me Liberty podcast, starting now. Could freedom be defended in the Western Hemisphere by those who truck our food, clothing, oil and gas and pharmaceuticals and, I don't know, pretty much everything else under the sun? Truckers have always been important to transportation of almost every good and service, but right now they are proving instrumental in defending the cause of freedom. Of all the mandates and lockdowns that have taken place over the past 2 years in Canada, the vaccine mandate that went into effect January 15th is the straw that broke the camel's back. Just a week or so ago, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called this massive protest a, quote, small fringe minority of people. Most of the media refused to cover it accurately, trying to dispel any idea that this was a larger movement or that it had popular support among Canadians. The Canadian government and the major media corporations would not tell the truth about what was happening. This small fringe minority turned out to be thousands. Ottawa has since declared a state of emergency after the city streets have been virtually shut down by big rig trucks. Now, it's also interesting to see just how desperate the ruling class in Canada has been to keeping this small fringe minority of people properly quelled. The Ottawa police chief on Monday said that he would need more than 1,800 cops and civilians to help dismantle the protest. The mayor of Ottawa, Jim Watson, said, "Clearly we've been outnumbered and are losing this battle." The police even shut off the diesel fuel supply that are keeping the rigs gassed up and heated, as well as seizing propane tanks that provide the protesters with additional heat. They are making arrests and issuing fines, all while doing this. No surprise that Silicon Valley is offering aid to the establishment and the ruling class of Canada. They are a member of the same class. California-based GoFundMe, for example, seized over $10 million in online funds, claiming that there was violence in the street of Ottawa. This was only when 3 arrests had been made at the time. Yet the same GoFundMe company funded Antifa, Chaz, and CHOP during the Summer of Love peaceful protests that dragged on for months in Portland, Seattle, and other parts of the country. No violence then, except for fires to police stations, broken storefront windows, city halls being vandalized, and all the rest. GoFundMe only reversed that decision to confiscate funds when Attorney General Ken Paxton of Texas, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, and others threatened to open an investigation into GoFundMe's business activities. If all of this were not gaslighting enough, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who has had his country on total lockdown for nearly 2 years, blasted the Freedom Convoy this week for blockading the economy, democracy, and the daily lives of Canada's citizens. Really? According to Trudeau, the convoy has to stop. The convoy is threatening Canada's citizens and infringing upon their rights, but not COVID lockdown policy, not draconian measures, jailings, fines, and all of Canada's policies up to this point. Ask any Canadian pastor how they've been treated by Trudeau's government over the past 2 years. Ask them whether the truckers and this protest is really a threat to their freedom. Ask if they believe that their lives have suddenly been disrupted by the caravan in Ottawa. Ask them how the truckers have not made it possible for them to worship on Sunday. The reason these truckers are a threat is because they are the only organized group right now that holds any promise for opening up Canada again. The biggest threat to the authoritarian regime in Canada are the very people responsible for the transportation of the nation's entire supply chain. And that fact alone has embarrassed Canada's Prime Minister and ruling class that is more than comfortable managing Canada's economy this way. My prayer, and I hope the prayer of anyone following this story, is that this movement continues to grow and to be supported beyond being a small fringe minority of people. Of course, it's well beyond that now, but let's make it impossible for the same people to tell the same lie tomorrow. Speaking of a small fringe minority of people, David Brooks, longtime progressive or moderate, depending on the day of the week, has recently made waves around the metaverse with an op-ed piece published last week in the New York Times titled "The Dissenters, Trying to Save Evangelicalism from Itself." Now, this may not surprise you that this article is not written primarily for evangelicals, but largely it's secular and leftist detractors who are yet again looking for an opportunity to spar with the boogeyman of white evangelical Christian nationalism. If you haven't heard of white evangelicalism or Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism, you've been hiding under a rock. It is the new pejorative term to identify everything that the left and the more mushy moderates hate. In his article, Brooks identifies a wide group of current and ex-evangelical personalities who vary in importance and notoriety and who differ on a variety of theological issues, but are all similar in their fashionable tastes and disgusts of cultural Christianity and what they call the partisan political divide that has come to dominate the public conversation around evangelicalism over the past 5 years. Brooks writes, quote, "Of course there is a lot of division around many parts of American society, but for evangelicals who have dedicated their lives to Jesus, the problem is deeper. Christians are supposed to believe in the spiritual unity of the church while differing over politics and other secondary matters. They are in theory supposed to be unified by their shared first love as brothers and sisters in Christ. Their common devotion is supposed to bring out the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control." Now stop right there for a second and consider the veracity of his statement. Yes, Christians are supposed to believe in the spiritual unity of the church, as Brooks says. Yes, they are supposed to be unified in their shared first love. That's Christ himself. And yes, Christians are to be commonly devoted to the fruits of the Spirit, as the Apostle Paul outlines in Galatians chapter 5. All of this is true, but what is assumed that is patently false are the secondary cultural and political matters that have come to define the American political narrative that are completely incompatible with a Christian moral ethic. Does life begin at conception or not? Are there two genders or no genders? What is God's purpose in marriage? Are children the ultimate responsibility of the state or their parents? Is religious liberty an inherent pre-political right, or is it up for negotiation? What's the point of all these questions? These questions are the delineating factors in determining your politics in 2022. These are the political issues. It's not some strange, esoteric, out-of-reach concept that isn't automatically familiar to the kitchen table of every American family. Let's get one thing straight. When people like David Brooks or people in Big Eva talk about secondary political issues, it is meant to obfuscate the facts and confuse the obvious. We are not debating whether or not to provide free parking or parking meters in front of City Hall. We are not debating a marginal tax rate. We are not debating the balanced budget amendments or term limits. The Jack Kemps and Paul Ryans are hardly found anywhere anymore in the ranks of politics. These are secondary matters and can be treated as such. The debate is on the pressing moral issues of our day. These are life-changing and earth-shattering realities. They are unprecedented when you think about the history of this country and where it used to stand on marriage, family, the sanctity of human life, the dignity of work, the right to private property, the right to personal privacy. You cannot bank on any of these. And an evangelicalism that is preoccupied with maintaining their first love, Jesus Christ, will love what Christ loves and hate what Christ hates. So are these issues dividing a unified church? as the New York Times attempts to point out, or are they dividing two groups that equally claim to be evangelical? Yes, Brooks points to the obvious sin of those who are a walking contradiction in terms. Where Scripture is not silent, neither should the church be in calling out sin and calling fellow Christians to repentance and greater faithfulness in Jesus Christ. But who is really being divided in evangelical politics? To be clear, the word evangelical is often used in geopolitical terms and does not account for a doctrinally tested and universal standard applied to everyone who publicly self-identifies for a Pew Research study. It's even proving more difficult among pastor scholars and theologians who should and do know better and sign confessional statements they themselves do not live up to but love to hide behind. Regardless, the Times article makes clear there is partisanship everywhere, and it shows up in the most ironic ways. Those whose beliefs are based on the unchanging Word of God are always lost in this shuffle, and those whose beliefs are considered fashionable to secular society are always pushed to the top of pile or given choice interviews by corporate media groups for the public flagellation of all evangelicals. Their point is almost never misunderstood because it is directed at castigating normal, ordinary, everyday evangelicals who are the real threat to the comforts and tastes of being secular, which is the subject of my next conversation in an interview with Samuel Say at Slow to Write on the Give Me Liberty podcast right after this.
America was never free. 1, 2, 3, 4. Slavery, genocide, and war. 5, 6, 7, 8. America was never free.
We have to go to the grocery store. We have to go to the drugstore. We have to go to work. We don't have to go to church.
By meeting, we're testifying the government has no jurisdiction here, not with regard to our worship.
Today, the ideological left is moving towards total deconstruction of every institution in order to upend freedom. And tragically, those who should know better are only willing to finesse the problem without defeating it. Be winsome and broker peace with an enemy devoted to destruction. Well, we know better. The fundamental challenges we face are generational and spiritual, not just cultural. We need courage, not cowardice. And the church must take its stand publicly for the gospel and say to today's authorities,
we have to obey God rather than men.
Parents must take back the responsibility for the education of their children. Young people are bold and hungry for truth, but they need bold leadership. We must take a stand for life, liberty, and truth to ensure the foundations of freedom exist for the next generation. Regardless of what contemporary historians say, America was founded by Christians as a nation committed to the highest principles of freedom. And if we are to keep this nation free, we must mobilize faithful men and women to stand courageously. That's what the Standing for Freedom Center at Liberty University is all about for such a time as this. Hey, welcome back to the Give Me Liberty podcast. And by the way, I have a very special guest, somebody I've been trying to connect with for a long time, somebody who probably you're very familiar with his writings if you've been over to the blog site slowtowrite.com. My next guest is Samuel Say. Hey, brother, welcome.
Thank you for having me, sir.
Hey, it's great to see you. You're making a transition right now. From Canada to the U.S., you're relocating. We were talking a little bit off camera. But for those who are following the Freedom Convoy, all the things that are happening in Canada with the pastors, churches, lockdowns, the mandates, what's happening in Ottawa, give us kind of a 30,000-foot view of what's happening and what's transpired maybe over the past couple of weeks.
Well, Canada has been progressing towards authoritarianism for quite a while. But over the last couple of years, especially through COVID, it's really escalated to the point where now, over the last, as you mentioned, last month, the government of Canada passed a conversion therapy ban, which essentially says that if you go against the narrative, if you agree with the biblical accounts of sexuality, then you could face jail time, especially if you're a pastor or a counselor. But then, as you mentioned with the trucker convoy, what's happening is over the last 2 years, Canada has been amongst the most extreme nations in the world concerning the lockdowns or vaccine mandates. So I just moved from my hometown of Brampton, is near Toronto, and they are still currently in a lockdown, the fourth lockdown. And yet there's vaccine mandates, which makes it almost impossible to do anything else if you are an average Canadian in the country and you're unvaccinated. So what's happening right now, the convoy is you have a lot of Canadians who are fed up with what's been going on in the country with the vaccine mandates. And truckers have, hundreds of thousands of truckers have traveled from Vancouver, which is basically the other side of Canada, driven all the way about 30 hours to Ottawa so they can protest the government's vaccine mandates. And the country, as well, the government is really escalating in their rhetoric and in their threats against them. Just this past weekend, you actually had, because of Trudeau's rhetoric against the truckers, you had a terrorist attack against a group of people in Winnipeg who were supporting the truckers. But the mainstream media here is not addressing it at all.
Yeah. So this is basically reaching a fever pitch. Canada is the most restrictive country probably in the Western Hemisphere. If you were to look at Europe, you've got a lot of restrictions there. Certainly outside of China, in Southeast Asia, you have Australia, which is supposed to be a Western democracy from the English tradition, right? Recognizing people's, civil rights and whatnot, and they're very restrictive. They're locking down everything. Canada to our north is the most restrictive country certainly in the Western Hemisphere and in North America, more restrictive than the United States or Mexico. And so through these developments, obviously we've seen religious liberty being challenged, not just with conversion therapy, but before that, you had pastors like James Coates, Jacob Rayom, and others who were being fined, jailed, because they were refusing to meet online separately, but following the biblical command, right, to meet regularly as a church. They were doing so, as is the tradition of the church, going all the way back to Peter, James, and John. And so now you have this convoy of truckers essentially making their way, caravanning all across Canada, as you say. And what I want to know is just more recently, this GoFundMe page, getting basically shut down and then I guess reopened. Is that right?
So it's not reopened. What is that Trudeau and some of the liberal or leftist politicians really advocated for GoFundMe and similar organizations to really stop allowing the truckers to have the funds, which would really help them do their protest. So then I guess GoFundMe complied. And then they said they would actually use that money, which is $10 million. They would use the $10 million to support groups of their own choosing, which would be leftist groups. And then especially the US politicians like Dissenters ended up throwing investigations against them, and then which made them say, wait a minute, well, we would face legal trouble because really you're stealing and it's fraud, right? You're right. One thing, and now you can use it for your own things that you want to do for yourself instead of what the original GoFundMe page was for. So then what happened is they're now saying they'll return the money back to the donors and not just to support their own organizations.
Okay, so this is actually even worse than I thought. So you're saying that instead of just shutting down the page and reimbursing or sending the money back to the original donors and saying, hey, we're going to put this back on your debit card or credit card or whatever, here's your micro donation. Here's, $100, $500, how much ever you put towards the Freedom Convoy. They were going to confiscate those funds and redirect them towards other political causes that would have been the opposite for what they were intended.
Absolutely.
That is theft. That's crazy. So I saw where Governor Ron DeSantis basically said he's going to investigate. I saw also, I think it was the Attorney General Ken Paxton of Texas also said something similar. The states can at least open up investigations within their own state, wherever those businesses might operate within the state of, say, Texas or Florida or wherever else. But it is fascinating to see how much the government has put its own weight, its influence into free speech, into censoring what these private sites are doing, private platforms. I saw where Jen Psaki, the Biden administration, were saying that Spotify needs to certainly do more to weigh in on what Joe Rogan is doing and what he is saying there. And let me ask you this, Sam, from your just watching that conversation, how do you see, is Joe Rogan winning this argument or is he losing there?
That's a difficult question because it's a great question, but it's difficult to answer because if he was anybody else, he'd be canceled already. If it was anybody else, Spotify would have removed all of his content and not just 40 or 200. I'm forgetting exactly how much they removed so far. If he wasn't as powerful as he is, he's bigger than the mainstream media. So if it wasn't for that, he'd be removed already. So on that level, he's winning by still having his content and his podcast still available on Spotify. But he's losing because really by already being so apologetic and really seemingly embarrassed and ashamed of his own podcast history, and them, him being okay, I suppose, with some of Spotify removing some of his episodes. He's losing because right now Spotify has a lot of power to dictate to Joe Rogan what he can do instead of him in the beginning having all the power to tell Spotify what he will be doing. So he's not winning. I would say if anything right now he's losing. So if I were him, I'm not a podcaster, but if I were him, I would start looking elsewhere because it's not looking very good at all.
Yeah. So in one sense, he's able to continue, but in another sense, this is almost like death by 1,000 cuts. Like it's an effort to mitigate or redirect, to censor his own profile to where moving forward, Joe Rogan, if you don't behave the way we would expect, we're going to then cancel you or something else. And so what you're saying is by him apologizing, already he's losing. Already he's shifting directions in the way that he used to be to where he's going to be going now.
Your future career will ask you to analyze, assess, implement, react, make smart decisions in a split second. With the Liberty University degree, you'll be ready because your first day on the equipment comes long before your first day on the job. Get ready to take on tomorrow, today.
Transitioning back to Trudeau in Canada, we're obviously seeing rhetoric that goes along kind of this critical race theory, intersectional lines, the way in which political messaging seems these days. It is so hyper racially charged and profiled that everybody now is in some kind of victim category, especially among Black Canadians, Black Americans. You have made lots of observations about this. Obviously, you've written a lot about this, about critical race theory, intersectionality over the past couple of years. This is not new to you. How are you seeing this? How are you reading this right now?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I mentioned in I wrote an article just this past Friday on whether the truckers' convoy was white supremacist or not. And one of the things I mentioned is is that it's very, of course, it's very easy, right, to label anything as white supremacist when through the critical race theory lens, it's very broad. So, for example, the government of Canada, in their anti-racist strategy, they label individualism as white supremacy. Right? I think that's also true for the federal government right now in the U.S. as well. So if you support individualism, if you support freedom, conservative then, including myself, is a white supremacist, right? So then it's very easy to label the truckers convoy and to label Joe Rogan as racist and white supremacist, which makes it easy to censor them. And then that way, if you can censor almost half of your, well, all of your rivals politically, then you end up obviously having to dominate media and then of course politics as well too, which is what this is really about. So in Canada right now, you had Trudeau's biggest rival, Erin O'Toole, being removed from the Conservative Party leadership, in part because of his views on the truckers convoy, which is because he was really against them. I think Trudeau is, and reports seem to show this, he's very concerned that the convoy could end up spelling the beginning of the end of his political career. And I think that's why he's using such strong rhetoric.
So in essence, what you're saying about Trudeau's own rhetoric is, of course, he's seeing the threat of what's happening politically, and so he's looking to sort of double down using strong language, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, Joe Biden has done a similar thing as well too, right? With labeling everything, as Jim Crow, or labeling everything himself as racist, because then he thinks it's an easier way to get a lot of the activists in the media involved into pushing his narrative.
Yes. And so then transitioning to something else, there was a recent development, Samuel, I don't know if you saw this, but it was basically over the weekend. It was an article, an op-ed by David Brooks. Essentially in that article, and this all relates, but it seems to come on the heels of a much larger sort of reveal that is taking shape, where I don't know if you followed Megan Basham's column over at the Daily Wire, sort of exposing the fact that so many evangelicals got on board quickly, not only with this sort of woke narrative, social justice narrative, but also this narrative of the authoritarians about masking and about making sure that everybody got a vaccination, and using kind of this strong, heavy-handed biblical language of love your neighbor. Samuel, this is the only way to love your neighbor, is to get the vax, to get the jab, and to make sure that your children do. Oh, and they need to get a second round and a third round. And as long as the government is saying this is for your good, Jesus agrees it's for your good. I just wanted to get your reaction to that, as you often observe and as you're seeing. Are you seeing similar things?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it wouldn't surprise me. I've not read the entire article yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if one of the names they mentioned there in the article as one of the Christians who are trying to save evangelicalism is a woman named Kristen Cobes-Dumez. I mentioned her because I'm actually going to do a book review of her book, Jesus and John Wayne, later this week. I mentioned that because her idea in the book is really that, now they would call it evangelicalism, but what they really mean is Christianity needs a new savior, right? They need to be the ones changing it, and Christ is not enough. But really, more than that too, they're saying that we Christians need to become either centrist or liberals or leftists, because they are liberals and leftists, and they want to redefine biblical Christianity and repackage it as a critical race theorist, feminist, leftist ideology, which of course it isn't. So I'm definitely seeing that, and it's concerning that while many of us have been warning that this war was really going on for a while, that guys like David French and Russell Moore were not really true conservatives. They seem to be more political operatives of using Christianity, using Christ for, frankly, a lot of anti-Christ agendas. And now they seem to be more honest about what their real motives are.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned Kristen Dumez's book, because that is something I took the dive. I went through, looked into that book as well. And there are so many stereotypes that you can tell. I mean, the book is more written as an ad hominem, more than anything, attack historically. Now, I would say it's very well referenced. She puts a lot of footnoting in there, and it looks like it portends upon being a kind of academic work, but not much primary sourcing, right? A lot of tertiary sources there, and it fits a profile or a caricature of what the left would say about the right, and mixes in some facts, but a whole lot of fiction as well. And I totally agree with you that it seems to be that what the project of that book is, and elsewhere, is let me give you a version of Christianity that we approve of. This has been vetted and pre-approved by progressive, liberal, and leftist alike. This is what we want, and we're appointing spokespersons for this kind of Christianity. Oh, and here they are. These people will represent you. Now go be quiet.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned earlier that her book sounds very much like the typical leftist critiques of Christianity that we tend to hear. I agree with you, but I'll go even further than that. It sounds very much like the critiques we get from unbelievers, period.
Yes.
That might seem harsh. The reality is, in her book and in some of her own words, I cannot say that her theology is biblical Christianity, is true Christianity. And that's very much true of, for example, the author of that New York Times article is not a Christian. So the audacity of a non-Christian to write an article about supposed conservatives and Christians who are attempting to save evangelicalism is quite ludicrous, right? That if you are not a Christian, how can you then talk about true Christianity or what it looks like? But so yeah, anyway, so I agree with you in what you said, but I think it's really more so unbelievers trying to influence Christianity by claiming they are Christians.
Very well said. Samuel Say, thank you, man, for jumping on with us on the Give Me Liberty podcast. And real quick for our listeners, our viewers, where can they find you?
Yeah, they can find me on my blog earlier, slowtowrite.com. They can find me on social media across all platforms at Slow to Write as well. And yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely, brother. God bless you.
You too.
Hey, thank you for watching the Give Me Liberty podcast. Please like and subscribe and share our content with a friend. Only a true friend can ever give the gift of the Give Me Liberty podcast. And if my dad jokes are lame, it's because I've earned it. God bless you guys. We'll see you next time.